So I joined Fairfax Media about 6 months ago now after working at another publisher. I think there's a few people from that publisher here today. And I'd have to say that I kind of have the opposite problem at Fairfax maybe that I had at News. So I think at News Corp there were probably a fair people that know about Fairfax, but sorry, I should say WordPress, but probably not a lot of people that were using it actively day to day. At Fairfax, I've kind of got the opposite problem, which is what I'll be getting into, which is there's just tons of people using WordPress. I'm an architect, and the first thing an architect does when they walk into an organisation is we do what's called an as-is. So we like to figure out what's already there. And I've been kind of shocked and stunned how much WordPress there is at Fairfax, so that's what I'll be talking about. I think this is why. So Matt talks a lot about this, I think, and this is a great statement. So it's about democratizing publishing, and one way people often would probably think about that is they're thinking, well, anybody can do it, which is true. You know, you or I, anybody in this room can use WordPress. It's a great system. But it also actually means that journalists can use it. And I think this is very important for a publisher because it's a tool that's designed for writers, for content creators, more than it's a tool, in some ways, designed for geeks. So I actually have a Drupal background as well. I admitted that, I think, at WordCamp 2 years ago. And that's kind of where I came from, and I came to WordPress from there. I've always been a user of WordPress, but never a developer. And what I realized very quickly when I started using WordPress is how fantastic it is for our end users, and that producers and content creators love it far more than they love other things. So we have 40 plus websites. Actually, since I started 6 months ago, there's probably another 6 or 7, and there's sort of one being built every month or every couple of weeks. I was having a look in one of the accounts, one of our hosting partners the other day, and there was 7 sites in there that hadn't been there when I joined the company. And that's not unique, like there's a lot of that going on. So we clearly needed a slightly better way of going about that. So why are we using WordPress? I've sort of alluded to this. It's very easy to train our authors. It's the most used CMS in the world. Many people have encountered it before they were a teenager, actually. There'll probably be people here who actually encountered WordPress when they were kids. I certainly, well, at least with CMSs, I fall into that category, which probably says how sadly old I am. There's lots of build partners available. There's many here. You'll obviously be talking to a lot of them. I can see a few in the audience, which is great. And they're of every level. So there's everything from a mum and pup shop that helps you build your community website or your church website. I know there's somebody here talking about that. To people like XWP and Human Made who build like absolutely massive, impressive things and everything in between, which is fantastic. It's very fast and convenient for journalists. I talked about that. For example, there's an app, which is a fantastic thing. So you can actually blog in the field, which is a really key thing for a journalist. They're often out and about. They don't have time to get back to the office. So being able to do things out in the field is like really key, I think. It's very fast to stand up, as we all know. That's contrast to some PHP CMSs in my experience, which can be, like Drupal's a really good example. I love it. Or is it Drupal? I always get confused. But it's it actually, you get nothing out of the box almost, and you have to do a lot of work. WordPress just works, actually, when you set it up, which is quite remarkable for a CMS, I can tell you, having used a lot of CMSs over the years. And this is compared to business CMSs, but even some other open source ones, it's just very easy to get going with. But, and this is the big but, as anybody who's used WordPress a lot will know, it is actually fundamentally less supportable than a lot of other CMSs are, and I know that's probably a controversial statement, but it is. And the reason is it needs attention. It needs care and feeding, unfortunately. It's not just something that you can just install like Wix, I think has been talked about in another presentation. You can't just use it. You actually have to give it some care and feeding. So, and when you're using 40 plus sites like we are, you really do need to give it some care and feeding or you get in a mess. So, what kind of sites do we use WordPress for? There's a bunch. So it's not the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald, just to be clear. Unlike, say, at my previous employer, where there's like one of the major sites in the country is actually running on WordPress now. And a lot of people don't know that, but it is. And if you want to know which one it is, you can come and talk to me or talk to some of the guys in the room who did it. So we do it for things like seasonal sites. So Women of Influence is something we do every year. So a lot of our event sites are built on WordPress, and we do a lot of events. Fairfax Media do 50 plus events a year, so we have a lot of sites for that. Not all of which are on WordPress, I might add. Some of them are on other things like Squarespace, which I think has been talked about, which I think is a great product if you just want to get a site up and you don't want to do too much care and feeding. We have a lot of actively developed sites that are actually the people who run them are quite technical. So Click is a good example. Click is our photographic. It's a great site, by the way. If anybody's into photography, I really recommend Click. It's run by our photographers at Fairfax, which means that it's got fantastic content on it, and they'll answer your questions. They're actually really good about helping you with your photography, and you really are talking to some of the top photographers in the country. So that's a great site. And that presentation team within Fairfax use WordPress really heavily for all sorts of things. We also have some that are not, they're actively used. They're used every day, well, not every day, but they're used pretty frequently, but they're not really maintained very actively, and this is always a challenge with WordPress because they're used by a sales group. So our Ad Center site, which is where all our digital ad products are, that's on WordPress. And then there's, I don't want to go into too much detail about the agency side of our business, but we build sites on behalf of other people, actually, as well. That's a big business for any media company in this day and age, and an awful lot of that is done on WordPress. So there's a lot of sales teams charging around building stuff in WordPress, which is terrific. So we really need a strategy for the scaled use of WordPress, and I would say that because I'm an architect and I hate mess. I like things to be neat and tidy, at least to some degree, and that's kind of what I guess I'm employed to do is tidy these things up. So these are the questions that as a large user of WordPress, as somebody who has a lot of sites, and by a lot of sites I probably mean more than 5. So just a quick show of hands, who in the room would have more than 5 sites? They would see there's quite a lot, right? So if you've got more than about 5 sites, I'd say you need to start asking these questions of yourself. So when should I use WordPress and when shouldn't I? I think this is tough if you love WordPress, and I do love WordPress to be clear, but sometimes you should use Squarespace. Okay, I'll say that one. I think sometimes you should use Squarespace. You really should. It's a brochureware thing. It makes absolutely no sense to do it in WordPress. It's quicker to do it in Squarespace, and you won't have all these aggravations I'm talking about. So I don't want to run WordPress down, but there are situations when you're doing a lot of this that you should think to yourself, that's not the way to do it. And in fact, we've got another system called Adobe CQ, or also known as AEM, and sometimes it's right to do it in that, particularly if it's an inbound marketing exercise or something where getting all the plugins into WordPress to get it working is probably going to drive you insane, frankly. You have to think about what's it going to cost me to host this at my traffic levels. Some of the traffic levels, even on some of those sites I'm talking about, are insane. So you really need to think about your hosting costs because some of your hosting providers might even turn you off if you get too much traffic at some stage, which is really bad. I can tell you, having had that happen to me. Because you might get a DDoS attack or something and they might just switch you off. So that's something to have to think about. How do I make my site secure? This is really important with WordPress. Unfortunately, with some hosts, you have to be on /wp-admin. That's a really, really bad idea, by the way. Don't do that if you can avoid it. But even then, you need to think about having a front end on WP-admin because every hacker on the planet is trying to get into WP-admin every minute. And I've actually stood up sites on AWS and I've seen them hacked I've seen hack attempts, I should say, within minutes. So you really have to be careful about that /WP-admin path as well as PHP-myadmin as by the way, as well. Really watch that one because everyone's trying to get into MySQL all the time. How do I automate my updates, or at least make it really simple? We're going to talk a bit about that. If I have an internal DevOps team, which we have, though we have developers, we have a number of developers, are they really motivated to run WordPress? This is a really important question. There are some like hardcore operations people out there when you work at a large company who hate WordPress with a passion, and part of my job is to be an advocate for it within my organization, but you're not going to win everybody over, and they may not want to do it. So you might want to think about, well, how do I get somebody else to do this for me? Because my people just don't want to do it, right? And that's an important question to ask. Our people do want to do it, I just want to be clear. But it could be a question you might want to ask yourself. And how many of them they want to do? How many of them can they support with the resources we've got? Because if you've got a lot of sites, it can be a lot of work maintaining WordPress sites, as we probably all know. What does your dev pipeline look from test to prod? Who here has both production and test environments? And put your hands, okay, I should have just said who has production environments, put your hands up if you have test, but an awful lot of people only have production environments with WordPress. This is a really bad idea. If you've got a lot of sites, you shouldn't do this. You should have dev environments as well. And some of the stuff I'm going to talk about will make that a lot easier. How do I get my code quality reviewed? Right, so we'll have a hands up of all the people who run WordPress sites. Hands up. And put your hand down if you don't always review every piece of code that goes on your site. That's pretty good, actually. We're doing well. We've got a few real pros in the room, I know, but you should always get your code reviewed. There's 2 ways to do that, and we'll talk about that. It doesn't have to be a human doing the reviewing, but you definitely should have something in place. Are my plugins safe? I think we all know what this means, so I'm not going to go too far, but you need to have a think about which plugins you're going to use, and when you're doing a lot of WordPress, you shouldn't use every plugin on the planet. You shouldn't let people pick random plugins. I think I can see Aaron in the audience there. He probably agrees with me on that one. And are core hacks allowed? The answer is no, but who has ever hacked core in the room? Put your hand up, come on, be honest. Who's hacked core? Yeah, okay. Did you do that as part of a commit to the actual SVN of WordPress.org? Or did you... Fair enough, okay. But anyway, the good news is not many people had their hands up, so don't do that anyway. But if you've got 50 plus, 50 odd sites, don't do it, because it's a terrible idea. You'll never keep things up to date. You have to think about your content delivery network costs. Who in the room uses a content delivery network? Yeah, quite a few now. It's funny because I asked this question 2 years ago and there was very few people put their hands up, so it's obviously become a thing people have realised. Content delivery networks, even now with AWS and things getting a lot cheaper in Australia, can save you a lot of money, so it's something you should think about, but you need to think about those costs, particularly if you're doing video. And there's some really, I don't have time to talk about this, but there's some really good ways to get your video CDN costs down, so if you want to talk about that, you can talk to me afterwards. And you've probably got some sort of membership system when you've got that many sites. We do. We have a thing called Member Center, and we actually use WordPress for some of our membership stuff, and you need to make sure that you've got a strategy around how that integration works across all your sites. As a hint, there should be one plugin across all your sites that's doing your membership integration, because otherwise you're going to have these different pools of users, and from a money point of view, that's a terrible idea. You need to have membership integration. So this is what you need to do. We're going to talk about some other things that people might be able to help you with, but this is what you should do if you've got a lot of sites. So all of your code and assets, and this includes WordPress itself, should be in Git, or something like Git, which is Bitbucket, but they should be in a repository. If you've got it sitting on a hard drive somewhere, even if it's a server, and you're uploading it with SFTP, you're not doing it properly when you've got a lot of sites. When you've got 1 or 2 sites, it's fine, but if you've got a lot of sites, please use Git. It's a terrible idea to do anything else. And have some release automation strategy. So think about something like Bamboo. So how are you actually sending the stuff up to your sites? Is a human going and SFTPing it? If you're doing that with more than a few sites, you probably should have a think about that, right? And there's plenty of good materials online about how to solve this problem, so have a think about that. You need to train your devs on your hosting environment, on hosting deployment and your local dev methods, and make sure the documentation exists for any partner devs. So at the scale that we're doing stuff, we're often engaging partners like XWP or HumanMade to help us with development and lots of other people. And you need to have documentation to explain to them your approach to using WordPress, because you need to have your own approach to using WordPress. Your core has to come from a repo. I can't overemphasize this. There is a repo in Git. This is getting a bit technical, I realize. Who knows what Git is? Can I just have a show of hands? That's cool, most people do. There is a repo for this, right? We all know this, and that's where your WordPress should be coming from. You can either get it from the SVN, obviously, on .org, or you can get it from the Git repo, which is, either way, that's where it's coming from, or it's coming from your hosting partner. We might have that discussion in a second if we've got time. You need to maintain that accessible list of plugins. So one of my jobs, and one of the jobs of like I know Aaron, who's in the room as well, is to make sure that we're using plugins that work and that we keep them up to date and we keep an eye on which ones we're going to use. It's not, once you've got a lot of sites, it's not open slather. Like, it's the plugins that work. And if you use a hosting partner, which we'll get to in a sec, they'll be pretty strict actually about some of this stuff. So you need to look at the hosts you're using. You need to choose some development partners. We'll talk about that. If possible, you need to get staff who are active community members. That's certainly at News Corp when we hired people. Sorry, I just mentioned my previous employer. I swore to myself I wouldn't do that, but I did. And certainly at Fairfax, we're looking at it the same way. So you need to look for people who are active community members. That applies to all of this discussion, really, but it goes without saying. Or they want to be. So the ambition to be a community member is okay as well, but they have to be prepared to accept that they're going to be coming to things like this. They might be presenting. These things are important, right? And they're important because we're an open source community. So. You need to develop 1 or more parent themes for your organization. We have a thing called Landmark, which is kind of our brand, and you need to have a theme for that. If people are randomly hacking up stuff to make it look like the corporate brand, you've stuffed up. There needs to be a theme. There needs to be a parent theme and probably child themes. That's probably, I think there's some discussions on themes. I won't go into that too much, but that's something you should be doing at this sort of scale I'm talking about. You need to encapsulate all your corporate requirements, so APIs, paywalls, analytics. We use Adobe Analytics, for example, in plugins, either off-the-shelf ones or you have to build your own. But don't, like, I kind of, again, overemphasize this enough. They need to be plugins. They shouldn't be just random PHP code, right? You want to have a proper plugin with configuration screen and the whole lot so that people can manage it properly. And you need to contribute to the community, so we all get that. So make sure there's even if possible, stuff going back into core. And I know my previous employer, there's definitely stuff that went back into core from that development process, and that's really important. Or plugins or whatever. So this is what a WordPress Flow looks like when you're scaled. So I'm not going to stop anybody from innovating at Fairfax or anywhere else. So if you just want to build something and stand it up and see how it goes and try some plugins out or whatever, that's fine. Innovation is really, really important in large organizations and small organizations. But what you need to decide ahead of time is what is the criteria, what is the criteria by which I will say I need to sort this out properly, right? So it's okay to experiment, but you should decide ahead of time, okay, once my revenue or my traffic hits these numbers, at this point I'm absolutely going to sort this stuff out, right? And that's, a recent project of mine was like that. How are we doing? Good. Okay, cool. So I have a process called weaponization, which is probably not the most attractive term in some ways, but what it basically means is either your internal team or perhaps a partner will come in and clean that up, maybe turn it into a multi-site, which is a recent example, and then deploy it onto some sort of enterprise hosting. So I'm going to have to go a little quickly now, sorry, I've got very limited time. You need to choose a dev partner. I would recommend that it's a blended development model, which basically means they work with you and you have some of your own staff as well. So it's fishing rods and not fish is the way I always put this to people. So I think most people will probably hopefully understand that metaphor, but you don't want someone to do all the work for you. You actually want somebody to help you get better at doing the work. Does that company have core committers? If they don't have or plug-in core committers at least. If they don't, as a hint, at my scale, or anybody who's doing more than a few sites, don't use them as a partner. It's probably a bad idea. Are they active community members? That's a really obvious question to ask. Generally they are, but it's worth asking. Do they have local on-the-ground front men? This is actually really important in Australia, and this is something people get caught out on. So if you're engaging a development partner, do they have staff onshore? Some staff onshore, but not all their staff onshore, and this is the subtlety. Because if you don't see a model where they've got an offshoring model and a way of recruiting people that's very like the way Automatic operates, and I probably don't have time to get into that, but if they're not following that model, then again, they're a bad dev partner. So they need to have onshore people and a really good offshore model that's clearly got a lot of quality control, where they're recruiting people who are community members and are great WordPress devs who are all over the world, because otherwise your costs will be too high. So to be honest, if all the developers are local, it's going to cost you too much money. If they've got some offshore developers as well, that's probably a good sign, but you need to ask them what are their processes for vetting their staff. And I see there's a few people in the room looking at me, and I think they know what I mean. So what do the hosting companies say? Ask Automatic, if you can, or ask any of the hosting partners like WP Engine and stuff. We'll get into that hopefully quickly. What do they say? Who do they think? Who do they recommend? That's worth asking. Have they done any sites like yours? And ask about lead times before you kick off, because it may turn out they're really busy and they can't help you. So it's always good to ask about lead times. If you're going to host it yourself, and I don't always recommend you do this, but if you can do this, then I'll just very quickly go through this. So you need to think about having a framework that's like the one the best hosting partners have. So Bedrock is one that we use. It's worth having a look at. There's some things I don't like about it. It reorganizes the WP tree, which are kind of always just like the directory tree, which always disturbs me a bit, but it is good, and I think it's worth looking at. We talked about Git and automation, so that's fine. As I say, WordPress is synced every 15 minutes onto GitHub, so there's no reason not to clone that repo, right? There's just no reason not to do it. Get your authorized plugins into your Git and keep them in sync. Make sure all your internal customizations are plugins or themes, and they're also in that GitHub. We talked about that. Do code quality checks. There's some great tools out there already. The VIP scanner is actually quite good, even though it's kind of VIP hosting specific. That's WordPress VIP. It's still useful. It finds all sorts of really dodgy things you should avoid in terms of like core API calls that have been deprecated, or ones that are just unsafe when you're doing a lot of hosting. Think about linting it. The WP Engine guys have got a lint. There's a few of them around, but that's one of them. Check for deprecated functions. Don't use deprecated functions, okay, when you've got 50 sites. Like, you need to go through, have a simple script at least that's scanning and looking for those deprecated functions. They're in the codex. They're not hard to find. Just don't try and avoid using them, right, because they're going to bite you for sure. And more to the point, if you've got any plugins or themes that are using deprecated functions, just, again, I would watch out. Internal themes should follow the guidelines. So if you're doing a theme yourself, it's a really good idea to look at the guidelines for the community themes and actually think about that, because they're there for a reason. Like, they haven't been randomly thought up. They're there to make them reviewable and supportable and good. Plugins and tools to capture your database from production and pull it into staging for every release candidate. This is a really important one. So you want to pull that database, your production database, because that's where you're going to be editing your content realistically, back to your test environment, and you want to be able to do that quickly and easily, etc. And security, please. I mean, think about a security front end like Security. If it's not built into the hosting you're using, one of the hosting, I won't speak out of turn because we'll get to that slide. Choosing a hosting partner. Talk to your dev partners once you've talked to, it's a bit recursive this, but talk to your dev partners. Integration with Git. So if your hosting partner isn't integrated with Git, don't use them. Sorry to be really brutal, at the level I'm at least, don't use them. Right, so if they're talking about SFTP and stuff like that, that's great, but that's like 5 years ago, so we're not doing that. Ticketing system, what's their ticketing system like? Have a look at it. That's really important, and even some of the big players have pretty terrible ticketing systems, so you might want to have a look at that. Do you get dev and staging and production included? With some hosts, you actually get like a dev environment that's just like built into what you're paying for. That's super convenient. You need to think about multi-sites versus many sites. I don't probably have time to talk about that, but I'm happy to talk about that outside. Geography of where the hosting is super important. USA is okay. This is going to be a bit controversial, this one, because I know I had this conversation with someone last night. The USA is okay. Australia is obviously good. Singapore is actually not so good, and I could explain to you in detail why I think that's true. It's mainly because I've been burnt multiple times by connectivity issues to Singapore in Australia. So it's not a good idea to have hosting in Singapore, actually. It's not a great idea, but people do it all the time. Is a CDN included? Because that can save you a lot of money. So automatic VIP is expensive, but it has a CDN included in it, which you don't have to pay for. So that's going to save you a lot of money. So you need to think about that if you're doing a lot of stuff that's going to use a lot of downloads. How do the core updates work? As a hint, fully automatic is great, which you get on VIP and WP Engine by and large. Pantheon, as an example, doesn't have automatic updates, but they make it really easy, so that's okay, but core updates are really important. Okay, I'm going to have a show of hands very quickly. Who's using, well, we know who's using WordPress, so put your hands up if you're using WordPress, and then you can take your hand down if you're not on the latest version. Everyone's on the latest version. Wow. On all your sites? Are we being honest? Oh, that's awesome. Things have changed, I can tell you, because I asked that question 2 years ago, and nah. So that's really good, but so I'm preaching to the converted, which is awesome, but just make sure that you're on the latest version for all your stuff. Is there code quality control stuff included? With VIP, for example, they do, got to wind it up. With VIP, they do the scanning for you. We'll put this presentation up after this so that you can see the full presentation, because there's some detail on here I won't have time to get to. What's the cost model for scaling? So I have a little spreadsheet that helps me with that. The security model, don't use any hosts that don't talk about security. And authentication for your company users. This, if you're a big company, you need to think about that, right? How are you going to use Active Directory? It's probably Active Directory. How are you going to do that? Because some hosts that's difficult. And this is my last slide, fortunately, and I won't go into this in too much detail. But what I recommend you do is you draw up a spreadsheet or a table. I did it as a table because I didn't want to put a spreadsheet in here. That says, right, here are my options. So these are 4 options I could talk about. AWS DIY, Pantheon, WP Engine, and Automatic. These are all pretty obvious big options if you've got a lot of sites. And here are the features. And then what I would kind of do is score this yourself based on what's important to you. So some of the key things we've already talked about, like auto patching, code vetting. Like if you wanted an environment that was always up to date and where the code was always guaranteed to be completely clean, like automatic VIP is pretty awesome because you can't release code that's stuffed up, and the site is always up to date and it's always secure. So that's awesome. It costs you some money, but that's awesome. If you want a bit more flexibility in terms of what you're doing, then maybe WP Engine is actually a better choice because it gives you most of those advantages actually, but it just makes life easier for you. So anyway, that's that table. I won't go into too much detail. Some of the things you have to watch if you're at scale are these columns here, like CDN, HTTP versus HTTPS, which is a subtle one. So you might have a requirement that you have to have some sites on HTTP because of your advertising partners or some of the like JavaScripty plugin things you're using. If that's the case, you have to watch automatic because they won't let you do that. Everything has to be on HTTPS, which could cause you some grief. And there's probably a few people in the room who know exactly what I'm talking about with that one. We had to do some pretty horrible things to get around that in one case. And think about the security side of things. Like, as I say, automatic's like completely robust, and pretty much all of these options are. But if you're doing it yourself on AWS, then you're best to be very careful and have a careful think about that. Okay, that's kind of it. So just in summary, I think WordPress can be used really well at scale. I certainly feel that, and I know there's a lot of people in the room that feel that. But it takes the right people and the right ingredients. So it's not just going to happen. This is not Squarespace. You're going to have to think about it, right? So thank you, and join us. We're actually hiring some WordPress devs at the moment. So if there's anybody who's really good at themes and plugins, talk to me, because we're actually after some devs right now to work on some pretty exciting stuff. That's it.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.
And